Imagine this, a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where neighbors still wave hello and life moves slow. An elderly woman, frail but full of warmth, carries her groceries home, completely unaware that in just seconds, her world and the world of one reckless biker is about to explode. Because when that biker makes the biggest mistake of his life, he has no idea who's waiting in the shadows. No clue that this sweet old lady's son isn't just any man, he's a trained Navy SEAL. And what happens next? Well, that's why you're here, isn't it? You want the truth. You want the justice. And trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to get every single explosive detail. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone push the wrong person too far? That moment when the bully picks a fight with the one guy who can end him with a single move? That's what this story is about. But it's not just about revenge. It's about loyalty. It's about a son's love for his mother. And most of all, it's about the kind of mistake you only make once if you survive it. Let's set the scene. The biker, let's call him Jake, thinks he's untouchable. He's part of a rough crew, the kind that thrives on intimidation. Leather jacket, tattoos, a sneer that says he's never been put in his place. And then there's Margaret. Sweet, gentle Margaret. The kind of woman who bakes cookies for the neighborhood kids and still writes letters by hand. When Jake targets her, he assumes she's an easy mark. Just another weak old lady who won't fight back. But what he doesn't know. Her son, Daniel, hasn't just served his country, he's one of the deadliest men alive. And when he finds out what happened to his mother, there won't be enough cops in the city to stop what's coming. Here's the thing about Navy SEALs, they don't just fight. They calculate. They wait. And when they strike, it's already too late for the other guy. So as Jake struts away, thinking he's gotten away with it, he has no idea that his life is already on a timer. The question isn't if Daniel will find him. It's how he'll make him pay. And that's where we're going to leave it for now. Because what happens next? You're not ready for it. But stick around, the truth is coming, and trust me, you do not want to miss it. Daniel had been overseas for months, another classified mission in a place the government wouldn't officially acknowledge. When he finally got that rare 48-hour leave, all he wanted was to surprise his mother. No calls, no warnings, just the quiet joy of seeing her face light up when he walked through the door. But the moment he pulled into the neighborhood, something felt off. The usual calm was broken by the distant growl of motorcycle engines, the kind that didn't belong in a place like this. He brushed it off at first, chalking it up to paranoia, the kind that lingers after too many nights in hostile territory. But then he saw her. His mother, Margaret, standing frozen on the sidewalk, her grocery bags scattered across the pavement, her hands trembling as a leather-clad biker loomed over her, his voice a venomous snarl. Daniel's blood turned to ice. The biker Jake had a reputation, though not the kind that made him a legend. More like the kind that made bartenders sigh when he walked in and cops rolled their eyes when his name came up over the radio. Petty theft, bar fights, the occasional drunk and disorderly. But today? Today, he'd crossed a line even he didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the way Margaret had accidentally brushed against his bike when she passed, or maybe he was just looking for an excuse to flex what little power he thought he had. Whatever the reason, he'd shoved her hard enough to send her stumbling back, her frail frame hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. And then he'd laughed. That was the detail that would haunt him later, the way he'd smirked as he revved his engine, like it was all some big joke. What Jake didn't see was the shadow moving behind him. Daniel had parked his car blocks away, slipping into the neighborhood like a ghost, the way he'd been trained to do. He didn't rush. Didn't yell. That wasn't how this worked. Instead, he watched. Memorized the bike's plates. The patches on Jake's vest. The way he carried himself, arrogant, sloppy, like he'd never once had to face real consequences. Daniel's hands didn't shake. His breathing didn't quicken. But behind his eyes, something dark and unyielding locked into place. This wasn't just some stranger. This was the man who'd laid hands on his mother. And in the world Daniel came from, that meant only one thing: justice was coming. But here's where things get complicated. Because Jake wasn't acting alone. His crew, the so-called Iron Reapers, had been making noise all over town lately, small-time stuff, but escalating. A gas station holdup here, a protection racket there. Rumor had it they were trying to prove themselves to a bigger syndicate, which meant they were desperate. And desperate men? They make mistakes. The kind that draws attention. The kind that brings in people like Daniel, quiet, methodical, and utterly relentless. And then there was the detective. Sarah Vance, a 10-year veteran with the local PD, had been tracking the Reapers for months. She knew Jake was a loose cannon, but she also knew he wasn't the brains of the operation. That honor belonged to a man named Vince Kovac, a ex-con with a knack for staying just out of reach of the law. Vance had a file on him an inch thick, but no proof solid enough to stick. And now, with Daniel in the mix, things were about to get messy. Because SEALs don't wait for warrants. They don't play by the same rules. And when Vance starts piecing together the connections between the biker who attacked an old lady and the silent, steel-eyed man asking questions in the shadows, she realizes something terrifying: this isn't just another case. This is a countdown. And when it hits 0, there's no telling who's going to be left standing. So here's the question hanging in the air like a blade: what happens when an unstoppable force meets a man who's spent his life training to break forces like that? Jake thinks he's untouchable. Vance thinks she can control the fallout. And Daniel? He's just getting started. Stick around. Because the truth? It's worse than you think. Just as Daniel began piecing together Jake's movements, tracking the biker's usual haunts, the dingy bar where the Iron Reapers held their meetings, the rundown apartment complex where they stored their stolen goods, his phone buzzed with a message that sent a fresh wave of cold fury through his veins. It was from his younger sister, Emily. A single photo, timestamped just minutes earlier, the front door of her apartment, kicked in, the frame splintered like kindling. No note. No demands. Just the unmistakable message: we know where your family is. His mind raced. Emily wasn't just his sister, she was a journalist, the kind who dug into stories most people knew better than to touch. Had she stumbled onto something connected to the Reapers? Or was this about him? A warning to back off before he even made his move? Either way, the game had just changed. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. Meanwhile, Detective Vance was staring at a case file that didn't make sense. The security footage from the gas station robbery the Reapers had pulled last week, the one that had initially seemed like another sloppy, low-stakes job, had a glitch. A 2-minute gap in the recording, right when the masked men were emptying the register. But here's what didn't add up: gas station cameras don't just glitch. Not like that. Not unless someone knew how to make them. And the way the thieves moved? Too precise. Too coordinated. Not the work of the same knuckle-draggers who thought shaking down an old lady for kicks was a good idea. It was almost like they'd had help. Professional help. The kind that made Vance wonder if the Reapers were really calling the shots or if they were just pawns in something much bigger. And then there was Jake. He'd been riding high on the adrenaline of his little power play, bragging to his crew about how he'd put some old hag in her place. But the moment he strutted into the Reapers' hideout that night, Vince Kovac grabbed him by the throat and slammed him against the wall. "You stupid son of a bitch," Vince hissed, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and rage. "That woman you messed with? Her kid's got friends in places that end people like us." Jake's bravado crumbled. Because Vince wasn't just angry, he was scared. And that was the moment Jake realized he'd stepped into something far over his head. But here's the kicker: Vince wasn't worried about Daniel. Not yet. He was worried about the other players. The ones who'd been pulling the Reapers' strings for months. The ones who wouldn't take kindly to loose ends. By the time Daniel reached Emily's apartment, she was gone. No signs of a struggle beyond the broken door. Her laptop was still open on the kitchen table, a single file left on the screen, a list of shell companies, all tied to a shadowy corporation called Blackwater Holdings. The name sent a jolt through Daniel. He'd heard it before. In briefings. In whispers. The kind of outfit that didn't just break laws, it rewrote them. And if the Reapers were mixed up with them? Then this wasn't just a biker gang. It was a front. One that would burn anyone who got too close. So now the pieces were on the table, but the picture they formed was anything but clear. Was Emily's disappearance a warning? A kidnapping? Or had she gone underground, chasing a lead too dangerous to share? Was Vince Kovac the real threat, or was he just another cog in a machine he didn't understand? And Daniel, caught between his need for vengeance and the dawning realization that his family was tangled in something far bigger than one biker's brutality, would have to decide how far he was willing to go. Because in this game, there were no rules. Only survivors. Stick around. The truth is coming, and it's darker than anyone imagined. The moment Daniel opened Emily's encrypted backup drive, the one she'd hidden behind a false panel in her closet, the way he'd taught her years ago, the entire narrative shattered. The files weren't just about shell companies or shady corporations. They were about him. Surveillance photos. Deployment records. Even a grainy shot of Daniel in full gear, taken during a mission he'd sworn was classified beyond clearance. At the bottom of the folder was a single audio file, timestamped the night before the attack on their mother. Emily's voice, shaky but sharp, filled the room. "If you're hearing this, I'm already in trouble. Danny, this isn't random. They targeted Mom because of you. Because of what you know. And if I'm right, you're not the only one they're watching." The floor dropped out from under him. All this time, he'd assumed Jake was just some thug looking for an easy target. But what if the whole thing had been staged? What if that accidental collision, the shove, the laughter, it was all a message? A way to draw Daniel into the open? The realization hit like a sniper's bullet. His mother hadn't been a victim of chance. She'd been bait. And he'd walked right into the trap. Detective Vance's case took a nosedive that same hour when her captain called her into his office and slid a transfer request across the desk. Effective immediately. No explanation. When she demanded to know why, his face went stony. "You're asking questions about things that aren't your concern, Vance. Let it go." But here's what he didn't know: she'd already dug too deep. The glitch in the gas station footage? She'd sent it to a forensic tech buddy off the books. The response made her blood run cold. This wasn't a hack. This was military-grade wipe software. The kind only 3 agencies in the country have access to. Suddenly, Vince Kovac's fear made sense. The Reapers weren't working for some corporate shadow group. They were patsies for someone much higher up the food chain. Someone with the power to bury cops, disappear journalists, and turn elite soldiers into moving targets. And then there was Jake. Abandoned by his crew, holed up in a motel on the edge of town, he scrolled through a burner phone full of missed calls from Vince. The last voicemail was barely audible over the sound of labored breathing. "They're cleaning house, kid. You screwed up, but not how you think. That old lady? She was never part of the gunshot." Static. Jake's hands shook as he replayed it. Because here's the thing: he had been set up. Just not by Daniel. By the same people who'd promised the Reapers easy money for distractions. The same people who'd given them those slick, untraceable bikes. The same people who'd known exactly who Daniel was when they sent Jake to that street. The pieces clicked together like a rifle bolt sliding home. This wasn't about a biker's ego or a SEAL's revenge. It was about a secret so big, someone was willing to burn entire lives to keep it buried. And Daniel? He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the one being hunted. But here's what they didn't count on: when you back a Navy SEAL into a corner, you don't get a fight. You get a reckoning. The question is, who's really pulling the strings?
And how many more bodies will drop before the truth comes out? Stick around.
The lies are about to unravel.
Daniel stood in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, the weight of Emily's files heavy in his hands, his mind racing through every possible angle. Who had the power to manipulate a biker gang into targeting his family? Who could bury police investigations and access military-grade tech? The answer was a ghost, a specter lurking just beyond his reach, and the only person who might have the missing pieces was someone he hadn't spoken to in years, his former commanding officer, Commander Rios. The man who had personally greenlit his most classified missions. The man who had once told him, some truths aren't worth dying for. But reaching out to Rios was a gamble. If the wrong people were watching, it could put a target on both their backs. Yet as Daniel scrolled through Emily's research, one name kept resurfacing: Operation Black Sand. A mission he'd been part of years ago, scrubbed from official records, buried so deep even most SEALs had never heard of it. The only proof it had ever existed was a single photo in Emily's files: a group of men in civilian clothes standing in front of a private military convoy, their faces blurred but their insignia visible. The same insignia Daniel had seen on a patch in Jake's hideout. The connection was undeniable, but the implications were unthinkable. Had his own government set him up? Meanwhile, Detective Vance sat in her car outside the precinct, her badge on the passenger seat, her fingers hovering over the ignition. The transfer order was a death sentence for her career, but worse, it was proof she was getting too close. She had one last card to play: an old informant, a disgraced FBI cyber specialist named Malik, who owed her a favor. When she called, his voice was tense. "Vance, you're digging into something that's gonna get you disappeared. Those shell companies? They're not just fronts. They're graves." Before she could press him, the line went dead. Seconds later, her dashboard lit up with an incoming message: an address, a time, and 3 chilling words: bring the SEAL. Jake, meanwhile, was running out of time. The motel room smelled of sweat and stale beer, his reflection in the cracked mirror a far cry from the tough guy biker he'd pretended to be. The voicemail from Vince played on a loop in his mind: their cleaning house. He knew what that meant. He'd seen it happen before to guys who asked too many questions. But this time, he had something they didn't expect: leverage. Buried in the saddlebag of his bike was a flash drive Vince had given him weeks ago, insurance he'd called it. Jake had never looked at it. Until now. The contents made his stomach drop: bank transfers, encrypted emails, and a single video file. The footage was grainy, but the voices were clear. The asset is compromised. Proceed with Phase 2. The asset. Not a name. Not a person. A thing. And in the background, a face Jake recognized from the news. Someone who wasn't just powerful. Someone who was untouchable. Daniel's phone buzzed: an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical. "You want your sister back? Walk away. This is your only warning." The line went dead, but not before Daniel heard a muffled sound in the background. A whimper. Emily's voice. The choice in front of him was unbearable: back down and let his family's attackers vanish into the shadows, or push forward and risk never seeing her alive again. But SEALs don't retreat. They adapt. And as Daniel stared at the photo from Operation Black Sand, he realized the horrifying truth: he wasn't just fighting for revenge anymore. He was fighting against the very system he'd sworn to protect. The clock was ticking. The stakes were higher than anyone knew. And somewhere in the darkness, the real enemy was laughing. Stick around. The betrayal goes deeper than you think. The warehouse door creaked open with a groan, and Daniel stepped into the dim light, his senses on high alert. The address Vance had received led here: an old industrial complex on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where screams went unheard and bodies went unfound. The air smelled of rust and damp concrete, but beneath it, something else lingered: the acrid scent of gunpowder. Recent. His fingers brushed the grip of his sidearm as shadows shifted at the far end of the room. A figure stepped forward, hands raised. Vance.
Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something worse than fear realization.
"We were wrong," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. "This isn't just about you. It's about all of them." She tossed a file at his feet. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Faces he recognized. Men he'd served with. Some marked with red XS. Others circled in black. At the bottom, a single sheet of paper with a list of coordinates and dates. Every Black Ops mission he'd ever been on. Every deniable strike. Every quiet disappearance the government had buried. Someone had been keeping records. And now they were tying up loose ends. A noise echoed from the rafters, a scrape of metal on metal. Daniel's spine went rigid. They weren't alone.
Vance saw it in his eyes and mouthed one word, "Run."
But it was too late.
The lights flicked on, blinding them, and a voice boomed from the shadows, a voice Daniel knew too well.
"Commander Rios.
You were never supposed to see those files, son." The betrayal hit like a gut punch.
Rios wasn't just involved. He was running it.
The man who'd trained him, who'd handed him his trident, who'd stood at his mother's dinner table and promised he'd always have his back, was standing there in tactical gear, flanked by men Daniel didn't recognize.
Private contractors.
"Ghosts, you sold us out," Daniel snarled, his finger itching against the trigger.
Rios didn't flinch. "No. I saved us. You think the government was just going to let a bunch of SEALs walk around knowing what you know?
They were always going to clean house. I just made sure I got to choose who walked away."
The truth was a knife to the ribs. Operation Black Sand hadn't been scrubbed to protect national security.
It had been erased to protect the men who'd profited from it.
Arms deals. Drug shipments.
Whole villages wiped off the map for the right price.
And Rios? He wasn't just a handler.
He was the broker. Vance lunged for her gun, but one of the contractors moved faster. A single shot rang out, and she crumpled, blood spreading across her shirt. Daniel's world narrowed to a single point.
No escape. No backup.
Just him and the men who'd turned his life into a transaction.
Rios sighed, like this was just another debrief. "Last chance, Danny. Walk away. Your sister lives. Your mom never hears another word about this. Or we do this the hard way." Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Too late. Too slow. Daniel knew how this would end.
But SEALs don't surrender.
They don't negotiate. They fight.
And as the first bullet whizzed past his ear, he made his choice. The real war was just beginning.
And this time?
There were no rules. Stick around. The final reckoning is coming and no one walks away clean. The gunfire erupted like a storm. Daniel diving behind a rusted shipping container as bullets chewed through the air where he'd stood half a second before. Rios' men moved like professionals, fanning out, cutting off exits. But they'd made one mistake. They'd forgotten who they were hunting.
Daniel wasn't just some cornered soldier. He was the thing they'd created.
And now, he was coming for them. Vance was still breathing, barely, her fingers clutching her side as blood seeped between them. Daniel dragged her behind cover, their eyes locking in silent understanding.
No time for words. No time for guilt. Just the fight.
He pressed her gun into her hand.
"Aim for the knees," he muttered. "Slows them down."
Then he was moving, a shadow flitting between the skeletal remains of old machinery, counting shots, tracking patterns.
These weren't amateurs.
But neither was he. Rios barked orders from the rear, his voice calm, like this was just another training exercise.
That arrogance would cost him. Daniel waited until the nearest contractor paused to reload, then struck.
A knife across the tendons of the wrist.
A boot to the back of the knee.
The man went down with a choked scream, and Daniel took his rifle, his ammo, his advantage.
One less shooter.
For to go across the warehouse, Vance proved why she'd made detective. A single shot rang out, and one of the contractors collapsed, howling as his kneecap shattered. The others hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. Daniel moved like lightning, putting 2 rounds into the next man's vest, knocking him back long enough to close the distance. The fight was brutal. Close quarters. No finesse. Just survival. When it was over, Daniel stood panting over the bodies, his knuckles split, his ribs screaming from a glancing bullet. Then Rios stepped into the open. No rifle. No backup. Just a pistol dangling loosely at his side. "You always were the best of us," he said, almost wistful. "That's why I tried to save you." Daniel's finger hovered over the trigger. "Save me? You sent a biker gang after my mother." Rios shook his head. "No. I sent them to warn you. To scare you off before you dug too deep. But you couldn't let it go. And now?" He gestured to the bodies. "Now there's no going back." Daniel's jaw clenched. He'd expected rage. Triumph. Not this regret in Rios' eyes. It made the betrayal cut deeper. "Where's my sister?" Rios sighed. "Safe. For now. But the people above me? They don't leave witnesses." A flicker of movement behind Rios. "Daniel." Barely had time to shout before the gunshot echoed. Rios staggered, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. Behind him, in the shadows, stood Jake, the biker's hands shaking around a smoking pistol, his face a mask of terror and fury. "You set me up," Jake rasped. "You made me their damn puppet." Rios collapsed to his knees, coughing blood, and Daniel realized the truth too late. Rios hadn't been the mastermind. Just another pawn. And then the warehouse doors exploded inward. Black SUVs. Men in unmarked body armor. The real players had arrived. Daniel grabbed Vance, hauling her up as Jake stared in horror at the advancing figures. No time to think. No time to fight. Just run. As they burst out the back exit into the night, the warehouse lit up behind them with muzzle flashes and screams. But the twist? Jake was still holding the flash drive. And what was on it would bring down empires. The end? No. This is just the beginning. Want to see how it all falls apart? Stick around. The truth drops in 48 hours. The flash drive became the spark that ignited the firestorm. Jake's hands trembled as he handed it over to a contact from Emily's investigative network, a journalist with ties to international media outlets who knew exactly how to weaponize the truth. Within hours, the encrypted files tore through the dark web before erupting onto mainstream news. Classified documents, black-budget transactions, and damning video confessions that traced a web of corruption from shadowy contractors all the way to the halls of power. The world watched in stunned silence as the story unraveled in real time, politicians scrambling to distance themselves, military officials resigning overnight, and the stock of a certain private security firm plummeting to zero before the markets could even close. Daniel stood in a safe house halfway across the country, watching the fallout on a grainy television screen, his mother safe beside him for the first time in weeks. Emily had been found beaten but alive in an unmarked van outside a federal courthouse, dumped there like a message. The scars on her wrists told their own story, but so did the fire still burning in her eyes. She squeezed Daniel's hand as the news anchor detailed the arrests, the investigations, the promises of reform. "It's not over," she whispered. "People like this don't just go away." He knew she was right. The machine they'd cracked was too vast, too entrenched, to be dismantled by headlines alone. But for now? For now, the monsters had been dragged into the light. Detective Vance recovered slowly, her badge replaced with something heavier, a whistleblower's target on her back, but also a newfound alliance with the few honest souls still fighting within the system. She'd met Jake only once after the storm broke, the biker's face hollowed out by fear and guilt. "They'll come for me," he'd muttered, eyes darting to every shadow. Vance had slid a burner phone across the table. "Then run. But if you ever hear something big again,
You call me first.
As for Daniel, the Navy quietly processed his discharge papers, no explanation given, no ceremony held. The trident he'd earned with blood and sacrifice was now a relic of a life he could never return to. But on a quiet beach at dawn, he stood barefoot in the sand, the waves erasing his footprints behind him.
The war wasn't over. It might never be.
But for the first time in years, he breathed. And then his phone buzzed.
An unknown number.
A single word. Watch your six.
The screen went dark.
Somewhere, a new game was already beginning. But that's a story for another time.
For now,
sleep easy. The wolves are still out there. But so are the hunters.
END. Like this ending? Smash that subscribe button. Real life conspiracies drop every week. And trust me, the truth? It's stranger than fiction.